Captain Taman walked back and forth across the bridge of the Harmony's light, while his crew worked at their stations with shaking hands and worried faces, the ship floating dead in space like a broken toy that someone had thrown away and forgotten about in the endless darkness between the stars where no help would ever come, unless they did something very dangerous and very stupid that might kill them all, but might also be their only chance to live through this terrible day that had started so well when they left the station with hopes of delivering their precious cargo of refugees to safety, but now seemed likely to end with all of them dead or worse if the pirates came back with more ships like they always did when they found something valuable worth taking. The reptilian captain's green scales caught the red emergency lights as he moved from station to station, checking on his crew who were mostly trying not to panic while they worked on repairs that everyone knew would take days to complete properly. But they only had hours before the Void Reapers returned with reinforcements to finish what they had started, when they attacked without warning and disabled the quantum drive with weapons that cut through their shields, like they were made of paper instead of the best military-grade protection that Coalition credits could buy, from the finest shipyards in known space. Chief Engineer Yu Jin looked up from her console with compound eyes that reflected the flickering displays showing damage reports that got worse every time she ran another diagnostic on the engines. Her insectoid features twisted with the kind of expression that her species made when they had to deliver bad news to someone who really did not want to hear it, but needed to know the truth anyway, because lies would not fix broken machinery or bring back the dead crew members who were already floating in the medical bay under white sheets that covered their faces. Captain, the quantum drive core is cracked beyond our ability to repair it with the tools and materials we have on board, she said in the clicking voice that all Clixari used when they spoke Coalition standard. We would need at least 3 days in a proper shipyard, with replacement parts that cost more than this entire ship is worth, and even then there is no guarantee that we could make it work again without completely rebuilding the entire propulsion system from the ground up. The bridge fell silent except for the constant beeping of alarms and the hum of life support systems that sounded different now somehow, more fragile as if they too might fail at any moment, leaving them to die slowly in the cold vacuum of space, while the pirates waited for their air to run out before coming back to claim whatever was left of their cargo and sell the survivors into slavery on worlds where no one would ever look for them or care what happened to people who had already lost everything they ever owned or loved. Taimin stopped walking and stood very still while he thought about the refugees in the lower decks who trusted him to get them to safety after their worlds had been destroyed by wars that had nothing to do with them, but everything to do with the greed and hatred of species who saw other forms of life as nothing more than resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated depending on what served their interests better at any given moment in the endless cycle of violence that plagued the Outer Rim territories where law and order were just words that people said but never. Enforced Communications Officer Subin turned in her chair to face the captain, with the kind of look that meant she had an idea, but it was not a good idea, and she knew it was not a good idea. But it might be the only idea they had left, even though it could make their situation much worse than it already was, which seemed impossible. But the universe had a way of proving that things could always get worse, no matter how bad they seemed at the time. Captain, I am picking up quantum signatures. That suggests the Void Reapers are gathering a larger fleet about 6 hours away from our position, she reported, while her fingers moved across her console, bringing up tactical displays that showed red dots moving in formation like predators circling wounded prey. They have at least 12 ships now, including 2 heavy cruisers that could blast us into atoms even if our shields were working at full power, which they are not. The captain felt his hearts beating faster as he realized they were completely trapped with no way to fight and no way to run and no way to call for help from anyone who might actually be able to help them, instead of just sending sympathy messages and promises to remember them fondly after they were dead, which was what the Coalition would do because that was what the Coalition always did when its citizens found themselves in trouble, in places where the government's influence did not reach. There is one option, sir, Subin said very quietly, as if she was afraid someone might hear her, even though they were alone on the bridge except for the crew who were all too busy, trying to keep the ship from falling apart completely to pay attention to conversations that might be about things they did not want to know about. We could send a distress signal toward the quarantine zone. Every person on the bridge stopped what they were doing and turned to look at Subin as if she had just suggested they should all jump out of the airlock and try to swim home through space using their arms and legs to propel themselves across the light years that separated them from the nearest inhabited system, where someone might care enough to mount a rescue mission that would probably arrive too late. To do anything except count the bodies. You mean send a signal toward Earth? Taemin said, and his voice carried the kind of tone that people used when they talked about places that existed in nightmares and stories that parents told their children, to make them behave better and not ask for things that might attract the attention of monsters that lived in the dark places between the stars, where civilization had not yet brought light and hope and the rule of law. The humans had been under quarantine for 50 standard years ever since first contact had gone so badly wrong that 3 different wars had started almost immediately afterward, when the Deathworlders had tried to help resolve conflicts by using methods that worked on their planet, but caused nothing but chaos and destruction when applied to problems that involved civilized species who preferred negotiation and compromise to the kind of direct action that humans seemed to think was the solution to everything. Sir, the humans are the only ones in this sector with ships fast enough and powerful enough to reach us before the pirates return, Subin continued, even though she was clearly terrified by her own suggestion. Their technology may be primitive compared to ours, but their ships are built for war, and their crews are trained for combat in ways that we cannot understand because they come from a world where everything is trying to kill them all the time. Yujin made the chittering sound that her species used instead of laughing when they heard something that was both funny and terrible at the same time. You want us to call the Deathworlders for help, she said. That is like asking a fire to put out another fire by burning everything in between until there is nothing left to burn. But Taemin was thinking about the refugees who had survived the destruction of their homeworlds, only to end up trapped on a broken ship surrounded by pirates who would either kill them quickly if they were lucky, or sell them into slavery if they were not. And he knew that sometimes when you were facing certain death at the hands of monsters, you had to take the risk of asking bigger monsters for help, even if those bigger monsters might decide to eat you instead of saving you. Send the signal, he said finally, and his voice was steady, even though his hands were shaking. Use the old coalition emergency frequencies and make sure they understand we have civilians on board, including children, who have already lost everything they ever had. Subin hesitated for a moment, then began working at her console to compose a message that would travel faster than light across the empty space between their dying ship and the blue world that everyone in the galaxy feared because its people had evolved in conditions so harsh that they made the worst battlefield look like a peaceful garden where nothing bad could ever happen to anyone. The message went out into the darkness, carrying with it the desperate hope that somewhere in the quarantine zone around Earth, there were humans who might choose to help instead of harm, who might prove that the terrible stories about Deathworlders were wrong or at least incomplete, who might be exactly what they needed, even if they were also exactly what everyone else feared most in all the wide galaxy full of wonders and terrors that no one could predict or control as the transmission ended. Taemin looked at his crew and saw his own fear reflected in their faces, but also something else, something that might have been hope or might have been madness, because in their situation, it was hard to tell the difference between the two, and maybe it did not matter as long as it kept them working and fighting and believing that they might live to see another day in a universe that seemed determined to prove them wrong. Admiral Boram Kim stood on the command deck of the UES Indomitable, watching the stars through the massive viewport that showed the beauty of space in ways that never got old no matter how many years she had spent traveling between worlds that most humans would never see. The newest dreadnought in Earth's fleet, humming with power beneath her feet as thousands of crew members worked at stations throughout the ship that stretched for almost 2 kilometers from bow to stern and carried enough firepower to level continents, if such terrible things were ever necessary, which everyone hoped they would not be. But everyone also knew they might be someday when humanity finally had to prove that the galaxy's fears about Deathworlders were not entirely unfounded. The bridge crew moved with the kind of efficiency that came from years of training and months of working together as a team that trusted each other completely, because in space trust was not just important, it was the difference between life and death. When systems failed or enemies appeared or any of the million things that could go wrong actually went wrong at the worst possible moment, Tactical Officer Dong-Ho Park monitoring sensor readings that showed nothing but empty space and distant stars, while Navigation Specialist Hai-Wan Lee plotted courses to nowhere, because they had nowhere to go and nothing to do except wait for orders that might never come from a government that still hoped they would never be needed. The alien distress call arrived like a gift from whatever gods watched over lost souls wandering in the darkness between stars, the signal crackling through the communication system with the kind of desperation that made everyone on the bridge stop what they were doing and listen to words spoken in languages they had been studying for decades, but never expected to hear, directed at them with anything except threats or warnings to stay away from civilized space, where decent people lived their lives without the constant threat of violence that seemed to follow humans wherever they went. Admiral, we are receiving a transmission on Coalition emergency frequencies, reported Communications Officer Min-Ho Lim, as he worked to clean up the signal and translate it through protocols that had been gathering dust in Earth's databases since the quarantine began. It appears to be a distress call from a refugee transport that has been attacked by pirates and is requesting immediate assistance from anyone who can provide it. Boram felt her heart rate increase slightly as she processed what she was hearing, because this was exactly the kind of situation that humanity had been preparing for during the long years of isolation, when Earth's shipyards had worked around the clock to build vessels that could protect their world from threats that might come from anywhere in the galaxy. Ships designed not for conquest or expansion, but for defense and rescue operations that no one else was willing or able to undertake when the stakes were high and the risks were greater than most civilized species were willing to accept. Captain Ji-Hoon Nam appeared on the main screen as his destroyer Soul's Pride moved into formation alongside the Indomitable, his face showing the kind of expression that meant he was thinking about the same things that were going through Boram's mind, as they both realized that this might be humanity's chance to prove they were not the monsters that the rest of the galaxy believed them to be, but rather the protectors they had always claimed to be, even when no one was listening or caring about their protests of innocence. Admiral, this could be exactly what we have been waiting for, Ji-Hoon said, and his voice carried the excitement of someone who had spent years preparing for a moment that might never come, but now seemed to be arriving faster than anyone had expected. We could show the galaxy that humans can be trusted to do the right thing when people are in danger regardless of what species they belong to or where they come from. But Boram was also thinking about the political implications of responding to the distress call, because leaving Earth's solar system without authorization from the Coalition would be considered an act of war by the species who had imposed the quarantine in the first place. Governments that still remembered the chaos that had followed humanity's first attempts at interstellar diplomacy, when good intentions had led to misunderstandings that had escalated into conflicts that had cost millions of lives and created the fear that kept Earth isolated from the rest of galactic civilization. If we respond to this call, we will be violating the terms of our quarantine, she said to her senior staff as they gathered around the tactical display showing the location of the distress signal and the estimated time it would take to reach it with the fastest ships in Earth's fleet. The Coalition will consider it an aggressive act, and they will have justification for taking military action against us, Captain Wu Jin, Choi of the heavy cruiser Defender, joined the conversation through the communication link that connected all the ships in the task force, his weathered face showing the kind of determination that had made him one of Earth's most respected naval officers during the years when humanity had been building its fleet in preparation for whatever the future might bring, whether it was war or peace or something in between that no one could predict or prepare for completely. With respect, Admiral, the Coalition imposed the quarantine to protect themselves from us, not to protect us from them, he said, and his words carried the weight of someone who had spent decades studying the political situation that kept humanity trapped in their own solar system. If we sit here and do nothing while innocent people die simply because we are afraid of what the politicians might say, then we prove that we are exactly the kind of cowards they think we are. The tactical display updated to show the estimated strength of the pirate force that was threatening the refugee ship, and Boram felt a cold anger building in her chest as she realized that 30 ships were preparing to attack a single disabled transport, carrying families who had already lost everything they owned and everyone they loved in wars that had destroyed their homeworlds and left them with nothing except the hope that somewhere in the galaxy there were people who still believed in helping others, even when there was no profit in it. How long would it take to assemble a response force? She asked her staff, and already knew the answer. Because Earth's military had been running readiness drills for years in preparation for exactly this kind of situation, when they would have to move fast and strike hard and get the job done before anyone could stop them or complicate things with politics and diplomacy and all the other tools that civilized species use to avoid taking direct action, when direct action was what the situation required. We can have 12 ships ready to jump in 30 minutes, reported Fleet Operations Commander Day-High Park as she pulled up the deployment schedules that showed which vessels were fueled and armed and crewed, and ready to leave Earth's orbit on a moment's notice. 3 dreadnoughts, 6 destroyers, and 3 support vessels with full combat loads, and enough supplies to sustain operations for several weeks if necessary. The command staff exchanged looks that said everything that needed to be said about the risks they were taking and the consequences they might face if things went wrong, but also about the opportunity they were being given to prove that humanity deserved a place in galactic civilization, not as conquerors or threats, but as the defenders and protectors they had always claimed to be in their messages to the coalition, that had been ignored or dismissed as lies told by a dangerous species that could not be trusted with the power they possessed. Signal all ships to prepare for immediate departure, Boram ordered, and felt the familiar weight of command settling on her shoulders as she made the decision that would either vindicate humanity's claims about their peaceful intentions or confirm the galaxy's worst fears about what Deathworlders would do when they were finally released from their cage. We are going to answer that distress call, and we are going to do it in a way that shows everyone watching exactly what humans are capable of when we put our minds to helping instead of hurting. Within minutes, the task force was moving away from Earth, at speeds that would have been impossible for any other species, because human ships were built with the kind of redundant safety systems and overpowered engines that only made sense to people who came from a world where the weather could kill you and the wildlife could eat you and the ground could open up and swallow entire cities without warning. Vessels designed by engineers who understood that in space you needed every advantage you could get, and then you needed backups for your backups. Because when things went wrong in the void between stars, they went wrong fast and hard and usually without any warning at all, as the fleet jumped to hyperspace. Boram knew that they were crossing more than just the light years that separated Earth from the refugee ship. They were crossing the line that divided humanity's past from its future, and there would be no going back regardless of what they found when they arrived at their destination, because the galaxy was about to learn that when humans heard a cry for help, they did not ask questions about politics or permissions or whether the people asking for help deserved to be saved. They just came running with everything they had and the skills they had learned on a world that had taught them that the universe was a dangerous place where only the strong survived, but also that strength without compassion. The human battle fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, like some terrible dream made real, as 12 massive warships appeared from nothing, with the kind of synchronized precision that made every alarm on the Harmony's light start, screaming warnings about incoming threats that the computer systems could not properly identify because they had never been programmed to recognize vessels built by Deathworlders who designed their ships according to principles that civilized species would never use because they were too dangerous and too aggressive and too focused on the idea that sometimes the only way to protect peace was to be better at war than anyone who might threaten it. Captain Taman watched through the viewports as the human dreadnoughts took defensive positions around his damaged ship, with weapons that looked like they could crack planets if they were fired at full power, massive cannons and missile tubes and energy projectors that seemed to cover every surface of vessels that were built like fortresses designed to survive anything the universe could throw at them while throwing back something even worse at whatever had been foolish enough to attack them in the first place. The size of the human ships was terrifying enough, but what made Taman's scales crawl with fear was the way they moved with purpose and coordination that spoke of crews who had trained together for years and knew exactly what they were doing, even though they were operating in a part of space they had never seen before, while responding to a call for help from species they had never met, who belonged to a government that had declared them too dangerous to be allowed into civilized space. "Sir, we are receiving a transmission from the lead human vessel," reported Subin, and her voice shook slightly as she worked at her console to clean up the signal that was coming through on frequencies that the Coalition had not used in decades. They are requesting permission to come aboard and assess our situation." The very idea of allowing Deathworlders onto his ship made every instinct that Taemin had developed during his years as a merchant captain scream warnings about danger and death and the kind of violence that humans were famous for throughout the galaxy. Stories told in whispers about what happened to ships that encountered Earth vessels in the dark spaces between stars, where no one would ever know what had really occurred or who had been responsible for the debris fields that were sometimes found drifting in orbits around dead worlds. But then he thought about the refugees in the lower decks who were counting on him to keep them safe, and the pirates who would return soon with enough ships to turn the Harmony's light into scrap metal and space dust. And he realized that his choice was between certain death at the hands of criminals, who had already proven they had no mercy for innocent civilians, and possible death at the hands of humans who had traveled across light years to answer a distress call from complete strangers. Tell them they have permission to board, he said, and felt his heart's hammering against his ribs as he gave the order that might be the last decision he ever made as captain of his own ship. But remind them that we have refugees on board, including children who have been through terrible experiences already. Within minutes, a human shuttle had docked with the Harmony's light, and Taemin found himself walking toward the airlock with legs that felt like they might collapse under him at any moment, while he tried to prepare himself for his first encounter with members of a species that every government in the galaxy had declared too dangerous for normal diplomatic relations, creatures who had evolved on a world so harsh that it had created beings who thought violence was the answer to every problem, and war was just another form of communication. The airlock cycled open, and Admiral Bo-Ram Kim stepped through, followed by a group of humans who looked nothing like the monsters that coalition propaganda had described in the reports that every citizen was required to read as part of their education about the threats that existed in the wider galaxy. Ordinary people wearing clean uniforms and carrying equipment that seemed designed for helping rather than hurting. Despite the weapons that hung from their belts, like casual reminders of what they were capable of if the situation required it, the human admiral was smaller than Taemin had expected, and her face showed the kind of calm confidence that came from years of command experience, rather than the savage aggression that he had been taught to fear from Deathworlders who supposedly solved every problem by shooting at it until it stopped being a problem. A woman who looked like she might be someone's grandmother if you saw her in civilian clothes instead of the military uniform that marked her as one of the most dangerous individuals in known space. "Captain Taemin, I am Admiral Bo-Ram Kim of the Earth Defense Force," she said, and her voice carried none of the threatening undertones that coalition experts claimed all humans used when speaking to other species. "We received your distress call and came as quickly as we could to provide assistance." Behind the Admiral stood Marine Colonel In-Ho Song, who looked exactly like what Taemin had expected a human warrior to look like, with scars on his face and muscles that spoke of a lifetime spent preparing for combat. But his eyes were kind, and he smiled when he saw the captain's obvious fear in a way that suggested he understood how terrifying this encounter must be for someone who had been taught that humans were barely controlled savages who might explode into violence at any moment. "We have medical personnel standing by if you have injured crew members," added Lieutenant Soo-Young Park as she stepped forward with a medical kit that contained equipment Taemin did not recognize but which looked more advanced than anything in the Harmony's light sickbay. "And our engineers are ready to help with your propulsion problems if you will allow them to examine your systems." The casual way that the humans offered help without asking for anything in return or making threats about what would happen if their assistance was refused made Taemin more confused than afraid, because this was not how Deathworlders were supposed to behave, according to everything he had been taught about Earth and its people, monsters who were supposed to demand tribute or territory or some other form of payment for their services, instead of simply showing up when called and asking what they could do to help. "Our quantum drive has been damaged beyond our ability to repair," he said carefully while watching for signs that the humans might suddenly reveal their true nature and start making demands that he would have no choice but to accept. "The pirates who attacked us used some kind of weapon that cracked the containment chamber, and we do not have the parts or tools needed to fix it properly." Admiral Bo-Ram nodded and turned to speak quietly with one of her officers, who immediately began working on a handheld device that projected holographic displays, showing technical specifications that looked more complex than anything Taemin had ever seen before. systems that seemed to operate on principles that coalition science had not yet discovered or had decided were too dangerous to pursue because they required the kind of risk-taking that only species from death worlds would consider acceptable. We should be able to fabricate replacement parts using our ship's manufacturing facilities, she said, after reviewing the technical data. It will take several hours, but we can have you back under power before the pirates return. The efficiency with which the human engineering teams went to work was almost as frightening as their reputation for violence, because they moved through the Harmony's light like they owned it, while somehow managing to be polite to every crew member they encountered, and careful not to damage anything that was not already broken. Professionals who clearly knew their jobs and took pride in doing them well, regardless of whether the people they were helping were grateful or even wanted their assistance. Chief Engineer Yu Jin followed the human technicians around her engine room with the kind of fascination that her species showed when they encountered new technology that operated according to principles they had not previously considered, watching as the Deathworlders casually repaired systems that would have required weeks of work by coalition engineers, using methods that seemed to involve more intuition than formal training. How do they know how to fix our equipment when they have never seen it before? She asked Taman during one of his visits to check on the repair progress. Their technology is supposed to be primitive compared to ours, but they are working on our quantum drive like they designed it themselves. The question bothered Taman because it suggested that everything the coalition had taught its citizens about human capabilities might be incomplete or simply wrong. Propaganda designed to maintain the quarantine, rather than accurate information about what Deathworlders were actually capable of when they put their minds to solving problems instead of creating them. Throughout the ship, human crew members were interacting with the refugees in ways that contradicted every warning that had been issued about the dangers of contact with Earth's people, sharing food from their own supplies and playing music to calm frightened children, while treating everyone with a respect that seemed genuine, rather than calculated to achieve some hidden objective that would become clear later when the humans revealed their true intentions. Marine Colonel In Ho Song spent hours in the refugee sections teaching alien children simple games that could be played without equipment. The Void Reaper fleet dropped out of hyperspace like a swarm of angry wasps expecting to find a disabled refugee transport helpless and alone. But instead, they faced a battle formation that defied everything they thought they knew about warfare in the civilized galaxy. 12 human warships arranged in a pattern that looked almost casual, until you realized that every vessel had perfect fields of fire on every approach vector, and the ability to concentrate their entire combined firepower on any target that was foolish enough to present itself as a threat to the creatures they had come to protect. Warlord Crix, the destroyer, stood on the command deck of his flagship Bone Grinder, and felt something that might have been fear creeping up his spine as he stared at tactical displays showing ships that registered power signatures unlike anything in his extensive database of coalition vessels, massive dreadnoughts that seemed to hum with barely contained energy, and destroyers that moved through space with the kind of predatory grace that reminded him of the hunting beasts from his homeworld before he had left it behind to pursue a more profitable career in the business of taking what other people owned and selling it to those willing to pay premium prices for goods that came without awkward questions about their origins. "What are those ships?" he growled at his tactical officer who was working frantically at his console, trying to identify the unknown vessels that had appeared from nowhere to complicate what should have been a simple operation, involving the capture of valuable refugees and the salvage of whatever useful technology could be stripped from their transport before it was sent tumbling into the nearest star as a warning to others who might think about traveling through Void Reaper territory without paying the appropriate tribute. "Sir, the energy signatures suggest they are human vessels," replied the officer, and his voice carried the kind of uncertainty that came from delivering news that no one wanted to hear. "But that is impossible, because the Deathworlders are under quarantine and have never been observed operating outside their home system since the restrictions were imposed." The very mention of humans sent a ripple of unease through the bridge crew, because even pirates who made their living by preying on the weak and defenseless had heard stories about what happened when Earth's people decided to solve problems through the application of superior firepower. Legends about ships that could appear without warning, and disappeared just as quickly while leaving behind debris fields that had once been entire fleets commanded by warlords who had thought themselves invincible until they learned what Deathworlders could do when they were properly motivated. Captain Narration stood on the bridge of the human cruiser, Busan Guardian coordinating with the other ships in the task force, as Admiral Boram implemented a strategy that seemed to ignore every principle of space combat that had been developed by civilized species over thousands of years of warfare, positioning vessels in ways that should have made them vulnerable to concentrated enemy fire, but somehow created overlapping zones of destruction that would turn any attacking force into expanding clouds of superheated plasma and twisted metal. All ships report ready for combat operations, she announced over the fleet communication network that linked every human vessel in a web of shared information that updated faster than any enemy could react. Weapons are charged, shields are at full. Power and firing solutions have been calculated for all hostile targets. The pirates had numerical superiority, with 30 ships including heavy cruisers that should have been able to overwhelm the smaller human force through concentrated fire and coordinated attacks, but there was something about the way the Earth vessels moved that suggested their crews were not particularly concerned about being outnumbered by enemies who had built their reputation on terrorizing merchant ships and unarmed civilian transports, rather than fighting opponents who might actually fight back with weapons designed for warfare instead of commerce. Admiral Boram opened a communication channel to the pirate flagship, using frequencies that would ensure every ship in both fleets could hear her words, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of calm authority that suggested she was used to being obeyed by people who understood the consequences of refusing to listen to reasonable suggestions delivered by someone who possessed the power to make those consequences very unpleasant for anyone who chose to test her patience. Unknown vessels. You are threatening a civilian transport under the protection of the Earth Defense Force, she announced, and her words seemed to hang in space, like a challenge that dared the pirates to prove they were as dangerous as their reputation claimed. Withdraw immediately, or face the consequences of your actions. Warlord Crix responded with the kind of laughter that his species used to express, contempt for enemies who they considered too weak or too stupid to represent a real threat. But there was something forced about the sound that suggested he was not as confident as he wanted his crew to believe about the outcome of a battle against opponents who had evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill them all. The time I am Crix the Destroyer, and I have been raiding these shipping lanes since before you humans crawled out of whatever hole you have been hiding in for the past 50 years. He broadcast back, there are 30 ships in my fleet, and only 12 in yours, so I suggest you withdraw before I decide to add human slaves to my cargo manifest. The response from the human fleet was immediate and devastating, as every ship opened fire simultaneously with weapons that turned space itself into a storm of energy and destruction that overwhelmed the pirates' shields and armor, like they were made of paper instead of military-grade materials designed to withstand the kind of punishment that normal civilized species considered excessive. Beams and missiles and projectiles that moved faster than anything the Void Reapers had ever encountered, while striking with precision that suggested the human gunners could put their shots exactly where they wanted them, regardless of how their targets might try to evade. Captain Hyun Woo-jang commanded the destroyer Tiger's Fury, as it led a flanking maneuver that demonstrated why humans had earned their reputation as the most dangerous warriors in known space. His ship moving through the battle like a predator that had found a herd of prey animals and was systematically culling the weak and the slow, while avoiding the desperate attempts of the stronger specimens to coordinate their defenses against an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. The human weapons were unlike anything the pirates had faced in decades of raiding, because they had been designed by people who understood that in space combat, there were no second chances and no opportunities to negotiate surrender terms with enemies who wanted you dead. Systems that fired continuously without overheating and targeting computers that could track dozens of hostile vessels simultaneously, while calculating firing solutions that accounted for every variable from ship acceleration to crew reaction. What shocked the pirates most was not the efficiency of the human attack, but the precision with which it was executed, because every shot seemed calculated to disable rather than destroy. Weapons fire that crippled enemy vessels without vaporizing them completely, in displays of restraint that suggested the Deathworlders were choosing to be merciful rather than simply unleashing the full destructive potential of their arsenal on opponents who had shown no mercy to the innocent civilians they preyed upon. Ship after ship in the Void Reaper fleet found itself crippled and drifting as human gunners systematically destroyed engines and weapons systems while leaving life support intact. A level of surgical precision that required not only superior technology, but also the kind of skill that could only be developed through years of training and combat experience that made every human crew member more dangerous than entire squadrons of pirates who had learned their trade by bullying merchants and refugees. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes from the first exchange of fire to the moment when Warlord Crix found himself aboard the sole remaining functional ship in his fleet while watching the rest of his command floating helpless in space with their crews sending surrender signals on every available frequency, a demonstration of human combat capability that was more terrifying than any massacre could have been, because it proved that the Deathworlders could have killed everyone if they had chosen to do so. "This is Admiral Kim to all Void Reaper vessels," came the calm voice of the human commander, as her ships moved to surround the disabled pirate fleet. "You will prepare to be boarded by Marine teams, who will take your crews into custody pending transfer to coalition authorities for trial on charges of piracy and attacks on civilian shipping." The precision with which the human Marines carried out their boarding operations was as impressive as their fleet's combat performance, because they moved through captured ships like they owned them while somehow managing not to kill anyone who did not actively resist their efforts to restore order to vessels that had been floating in chaos since their weapons and engines had been systematically destroyed by gunners who could apparently put their shots exactly where they wanted them every single time. Captain Taimin watched the entire battle from the bridge of the Harmony's light and felt his understanding of the universe shift as he, Admiral Boram Kim, stood in the conference room aboard the UES Indomitable, looking out at the stars that seemed different somehow, now that humanity had crossed the invisible line that separated their quarantined existence from the wider galaxy, where billions of beings lived their lives in societies that had declared Earth's people too dangerous to be trusted with the freedom to travel where they pleased and help who they chose to help, regardless of what politicians and bureaucrats might think about the wisdom of allowing Deathworlders to make their own decisions about right and wrong. The rescued refugees had been transferred to the Harmony's light, which was now fully operational thanks to human engineering expertise that had impressed even Chief Engineer Yu Jin, who belonged to a species that took great pride in their technological achievements, but had been forced to admit that sometimes the supposedly primitive methods used by people from harsh worlds produced results that were superior to anything that civilized science had been able to develop through centuries of careful research and cautious experimentation. Captain Taimin had requested a final meeting before his ship departed for Coalition space, carrying with it news that would spread through the galactic community faster than any official announcement could travel. Stories told by refugees who had seen humans at their most peaceful and most dangerous within the span of a few hours, and could testify that the Deathworlders were both everything the galaxy feared and nothing like what anyone had expected them to be. "Admiral, I want to thank you for what you have done for my people," the reptilian captain said as he stood in the human conference room surrounded by technology that looked more advanced than anything in Coalition databases, despite claims that Earth's isolation had prevented them from keeping pace with galactic scientific developments. "But I also want to warn you that there will be consequences when news of this rescue reaches the Coalition Council." Boram nodded because she had been thinking about the same problems that were clearly troubling the alien captain, political ramifications that could lead to economic sanctions or military action against Earth if the galactic government decided that humanity's violation of quarantine terms represented a threat that needed to be eliminated before it could spread to other systems where Deathworlders might decide to interfere in situations that were none of their business. "We understand the risks we took when we answered your distress call," she replied, "but we also understand that sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting consequences that might be unpleasant for those who choose to act according to their principles rather than their fears." The statement seemed to surprise Taimin, who had spent decades dealing with Coalition officials, who made every decision based on careful calculations of political advantage and economic benefit, rather than simple considerations of whether their actions would help or hurt people who needed assistance. a system of government that prioritized stability over justice and order over compassion, because those qualities were easier to measure and control than the messy emotions that drove individuals to risk their own safety for the sake of complete strangers. Captain Da Yun, of the medical frigate Soul's Mercy, had spent the past several hours coordinating relief efforts that provided the refugees with medical care and psychological support that addressed trauma from the destruction of their homeworlds and the terror of being attacked by pirates who saw other sapient beings as nothing more than valuable cargo to be sold in markets where no one asked uncomfortable questions about how slaves had been acquired. Her report showed that human medical techniques were effective on alien physiology, despite the lack of prior experience treating non-human patients, success that suggested Earth's doctors had developed approaches to healing that were based on fundamental principles of biology, rather than species-specific knowledge that took years to accumulate through careful study of individual anatomical systems. Admiral, the refugees are asking if they can request asylum on Earth, rather than returning to Coalition space where they have no homes and no resources to rebuild their lives, Dayun reported during the final briefing before the task force, prepared to return to human territory. They say they would rather take their chances with Deathworlders who saved them than with a government that was unable to protect them in the first place. The request created a diplomatic problem that had no easy solutions, because accepting alien refugees would be another violation of quarantine terms that could provide the Coalition with additional justification for taking military action against Earth, but refusing to help people who had nowhere else to go would contradict everything that humanity claimed to believe about the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves. Commander Jae Sung Kim had been preparing humanity's formal response to the inevitable Coalition inquiry about why Earth vessels had left their authorized patrol zones to interfere in affairs that were supposedly outside their jurisdiction, a diplomatic message that would have to explain their actions in ways that might prevent war, while also establishing precedents for future operations that Earth's government had already decided were necessary, regardless of what alien politicians might prefer. Sir, I recommend that we announce a new policy regarding distress calls received by Earth Defense Force vessels, he suggested, as the senior staff gathered around the conference table that had become the center of discussions about humanity's future relationship with galactic civilization. We should state that while we will continue to honor the quarantine restrictions that limit our normal operations, we reserve the right to respond to emergency situations where lives are in immediate danger. The proposal would effectively create a loophole in the quarantine that allowed human ships to operate anywhere in the galaxy as long as they claimed to be responding to distress calls, a legal fiction that everyone would recognize as such, but which would be difficult to challenge without appearing to oppose humanitarian rescue operations that saved innocent lives. Admiral Boram considered the political implications of the suggestion, while also thinking about the dozens of other distress calls that Earth's monitoring stations had detected over the years, signals from ships and colonies and space stations that had been attacked by pirates or caught in natural disasters, or simply broken down in regions where help was days or weeks away from the nearest Coalition patrol vessel. There is another consideration, she said as she looked around the table at officers who had proven their competence and courage during the rescue operation. If we announce that Earth will respond to distress calls, we need to be prepared for the possibility that we will receive more requests for help than we can handle with our current fleet strength. The observation highlighted one of the fundamental problems facing humanity as they considered their options for engaging with galactic civilization, because Earth's military was designed for defensive operations that protected human space rather than expeditionary missions that could take their ships anywhere in the galaxy where people might need assistance, limitations that would require significant changes in strategy and resource allocation if humans decided to become the galactic police force that no one had asked for, but everyone seemed to need. Captain Woojin Choi had been analyzing the tactical data from the battle with the Void Reapers, and his conclusions suggested that human military technology was superior to anything in Coalition databases by margins that were larger than most experts would have believed possible. Advantages that came from decades of research focused on developing weapons and defenses that could protect Earth from threats that might come from any direction without warning. Admiral, our ships performed better than expected against an enemy force that significantly outnumbered us, he reported. But we also learned that our weapons are more powerful, and our defenses are stronger than coalition intelligence estimates suggest, which means they have been operating under false assumptions about our military capabilities for the entire duration of the quarantine. The revelation that humanity was stronger than their enemies realized created both opportunities and dangers, because it meant that Earth could defend itself against military action, but also that the coalition might decide to take preemptive measures before human technology became too advanced to counter with conventional forces, a strategic calculation that could lead to war regardless of what diplomatic messages were exchanged between governments that fundamentally distrusted each other. As the meeting continued, Boram found herself thinking about the choice that would define humanity's relationship with the rest of the galaxy for generations to come, a decision between isolation and engagement that carried risks regardless of which option they selected. Because the universe was not a safe place for any species that wanted to survive and prosper in competition with neighbors who might see them as threats or opportunities depending on circumstances that could change without warning. I have made my decision about how we will respond to the coalition inquiry, she announced after listening to all the arguments and recommendations that her staff had prepared. We will inform them that Earth recognizes the legitimacy of the quarantine restrictions and will continue to honor them with one important modification.